The weapon charged before it finished moving. That was the part Chief Engineer Marcus Chen would remember. Not the Kael'thar warships bracketing salvage yard Theta-Nine on 4 axes. Not the red demolition warnings flooding every screen from the engine bay to the med compartment. Not even the escort troops standing at parade rest in the airlock with their sidearms already drawn. It was the sound, a low sustained thrum that bypassed the ears entirely and settled into the chest like a second heartbeat deciding whether to keep going. Salvage technician Priya Riley looked up from her console. Her voice was barely above the hum of the ventilation. "We're dead." Chen grabbed the treaty binder off the shelf above her head and ran. Demolition Officer Xylar of the Kael'thar Enforcement Directorate was standing in Theta-Nine's primary docking bay by the time Chen arrived. And the thing about Xylar, the thing every human crew that had made it out of a Directorate inspection alive had mentioned in their after-action notes, was that he looked bored. Not patient, not composed. Bored in the specific way a being with a loaded weapon gets bored when he has already decided to use it and is merely waiting for the administrative window to close. His carapace was the deep charcoal of old meteorite iron. His copper eyes moved across the bay with no more urgency than a man checking a shopping list. He did not look up from his data slate. Habitat structure designated Theta-Nine Alpha. Classification, non-compliant temporary structure. Demolition authorized under Directorate Order 774, subsection clearance of unsanctioned orbital infrastructure. His eyes came up then. "You have 30 seconds. Chen opened the binder. "With respect, officer, Theta-Nine Alpha is not a temporary structure." He found the page, turned it. "The reactor housing in Module 3, Korvian Model 7 Delta, serial number 8864 Alpha 9, has been formally registered with the Galactic Historical Preservation Authority as a provisional cultural artifact pending full documentation review. The automated provisional flag was accepted and logged 6 standard hours ago. Directorate Order 774, subsection C, demolition of any structure housing a registered or provisional artifact is suspended pending GHPA review. That review takes 40 to 60 standard cycles. The docking bay air smelled of recycled coolant and old metal, sharp enough to taste. Somewhere behind Xylar, a junior officer shifted weight on a boot seal and the floor plate gave a single soft tick. Xylar's jaw moved. The demolition rig thrum outside did not stop, but it did not escalate. The copper eyes lifted from the data slate. A reactor. A historical artifact. A Korvian 7 Delta. Chen kept his voice entirely reasonable. There are 11 remaining operational examples in the known galaxy. This one was present during the Vega Secundus incident. Destroying it without full documentation would constitute irreversible loss of historical data. The GHPA's legal AI processed the flag automatically. It is already in the system. Silence. The thrum held steady. A vibration Chen could feel in the soles of his boots, through 2 layers of deck plating, into the bones of his legs. Riley appeared at Chen's shoulder. She had brought a mug of something hot, not because anyone wanted it, because her hands had needed something to do. Xylar ran his own query on the data slate. Chen watched the Kael'thar's copper eyes track the results. Watched the moment the search returned a positive flag on the serial number. Watched the boredom shift, not into anger, not yet, but into something colder, something that was starting to pay very careful attention. The provisional hold does not cover the remainder of the structure. Chen kept his voice neutral. No, but Modules 1, 2, and 4 are integrated into Module 3's life support and reactor management systems. Demolishing them while the reactor operates would constitute unauthorized alteration of a registered artifact's primary operational environment. That falls under Article 12 of the Treaty of Vega Secundus. Article 12's radiation disposal mandate requires a full containment assessment before any action that would alter the primary housing of a registered reactor system. The escort troops had not moved. The sidearms had not moved. The thrum had not changed. Xylar held the silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that is an inventory of options. 30 cycles. Each word arrived separately and with weight. I will return with a full legal team and a containment assessment order. If a single component does not comply with current safety specifications, the provisional flag will not protect you. He turned to leave, then stopped, as if he had remembered something mild and unimportant. Clear the debris field on the northern perimeter by the time I return. Every piece, or the provisional hold will not be relevant. The escort filed out. The docking bay door sealed with a sound like a verdict. The thrum cut off. Riley let out a breath that had been building since approximately the moment Xylar had entered the bay. It was not a short breath. We bought 30 cycles. 28 now. Chen was already moving toward the engineering console. And we have a debris field to clear. The northern perimeter was 3 square kilometers of radioactive wreckage. Jagged, razor-edged hull plating sheared from a human relay station 6 months prior when the Directorate had decided its location was inconvenient. The fragments ranged from thumbnail size to shuttle size. All of them were hot with residual weapon discharge. All of them were sharp enough to open an EVA suit at a touch. Standard EVA suits would saturate in 4 minutes at operational distance. They did not have enough suits to rotate indefinitely. They did not have shielded collection drones. Chen looked at the dosimeter readings and then at his crew. Chen turned from the dosimeter readings. We sail them. He opened the salvage inventory. Solar radiation exerts pressure on reflective surfaces, a fraction of a gram per square meter under standard stellar output, but over distance and area, enough to move things. The hull fragments were highly conductive with irregular reflective geometry. Orient them correctly and solar pressure alone would push them in a controlled direction, away from the perimeter, into a collection zone on the far side of the debris cloud. The execution was not simple. Deploying guide pylons meant sending crew into the debris field in 4-minute EVA rotations, handling pieces of hull plating that could open a suit like a letter opener, and were emitting enough radiation to make the dosimeters complain before contact. Teams worked in pairs, one to handle the pylon, one to watch for drift. When a fragment shifted, you got out. When your 4 minutes hit, you got out regardless. 2 crew did not get out fast enough on the second rotation. Both survived. Neither would be cleared for EVA work for the remainder of the operation. Chen stood at the bay viewport and watched the debris field begin its slow migration. The solar sails, improvised from conductive foil sections stripped from the relay wreckage itself, caught the light in sharp, hard planes that hurt to look at directly, each one like a razored mirror. By the end of the 6th rotation, the northern field was clean. Chen logged the collection zone coordinates in his master construction file and did not mention anywhere in the official documentation what the zone was actually for. The ordnance came next. 7 Caelthar survey probes, unexploded, their guidance systems fried by the same electromagnetic pulse that had killed the relay station. Xylar's inspection manifest classified them as contraband and demanded disposal by end of the next cycle. Each probe was approximately 1 meter long. Each warhead mechanism was still live. Chen set one on a workbench in the maintenance bay and opened it. Riley stood 3 meters back with a fire suppressant canister and the expression of someone who had already begun composing her official incident report in her head and was working out how to describe a death by personal incompetence in the most favorable possible terms. Chen did not look up from the circuit board. The quarantine jamming runs on Caelthar military frequencies. Their own survey probes use a high-gain transmitter specifically designed to punch through Caelthar band suppression. They needed their disposal signals to reach command even in active electronic warfare environments. I know what it is. Riley's grip on the canister adjusted slightly. I'm asking what you're going to do to it. Make it talk on our frequencies instead of theirs. He worked in silence. The probe's innards were a dense tangle of crystalline circuit threads and field emitters, laid out with the architectural precision of a species that found chaos aesthetically offensive. Finding the guidance array took 11 minutes. Isolating it from the warhead detonation trigger took 23 more. His hand stayed steady. The maintenance bay air conditioning cycled twice and produced a sound like distant breathing. He rewired the transmitter array to broadcast on human compliance frequencies and filed it, before disconnecting the final wire as a communications infrastructure component. Required, the filing read, for submitting mandatory safety documentation to Nova Station in accordance with Article 12's reporting obligations. Then he connected the wire. The probe beeped once. The array powered up and locked onto the Nova Station carrier frequency. Somewhere beyond Xylar's jamming envelope, somewhere past the warships and the suppression field and the 30-cycle countdown, their first message in 40 cycles reached the Galactic Compliance Bureau's automated intake system. When Xylar arrived for the inspection, he found 7 probes in a certified disposal crate and a fully operational comms array mounted to the exterior of Module 2. Chen had the filing reference ready before Xylar finished reading the equipment log. Emergency prototype testing. Clause 9C allows bypass of standard equipment quotas for registered test installations. We submitted the registration this morning. Xylar's copper eyes moved from the comms array to Chen to the array again. Something in the Kelthar's posture changed. A very small change, barely visible. The kind of thing you would miss if you were not watching for it. A recalculation. An inventory of options that had just come up shorter than expected. Chen met his gaze and did not move. You can vaporize us, officer, but the paperwork for destroying a registered prototype test site will bury your career. The demolition rig's thrum had never sounded the same after Theta-Nine. It still came when Xylar came. But it arrived now like something that had begun to understand it was being used against itself. Loud and patient, and starting to suspect it was not in charge. Xylar filed 3 supplementary inspection requests on his way out of the docking bay. He did not vaporize anything. Not yet. The micrometeoroid storm showed up on long-range sensors 14 cycles before impact. A dense orbital debris cloud, residue from a dead comet's disintegration, crossing Theta-Nine's position at a relative velocity that would reduce the station to additional orbital debris in approximately 4 minutes of direct exposure. Chen sent an emergency request for Directorate assistance to Xylar's command vessel. The reply arrived in 40 seconds, which was faster than most bureaucratic responses. Its content was brief. Quarantine protocols preclude external assistance to Theta-Nine during active containment. Compliance with Article 7's non-interference mandate is mandatory. Good luck. Riley set the message pad down, picked it back up, set it down again. Good luck. In an official communication, they wrote good luck. The leading edge of the debris cloud was visible on the forward viewport, a faint shimmer against the stars still distant enough to look almost beautiful. Chen turned from the viewport. We're going to build an umbrella. He pulled the salvage inventory for the destroyer wreckage in Grid 7. The wreckage in Grid 7 was the remains of a Kelthar heavy destroyer. 800 meters of combat vessel sheared into sections by something that had hit it from multiple angles simultaneously, leaving behind a field of armored hull sections, structural members, and, critically, 4 operational grav plate emitters from the destroyer's artificial gravity system. Each emitter was designed to generate a stable gravitational field across a shipboard deck section. Individually, they bent local space enough to keep crew members on the floor. In array formation, pointed outward in coordinated emission, they would bend local space enough to deflect a micrometeoroid cloud, or, alternatively, draw enough power from Theta-Nine's reactor to cause a catastrophic overload. The margin between deflection and detonation was, by Chen's calculation, approximately 12%. He did not tell the crew the second number. Mounting grav plates from a warship hull onto a salvage station's exterior in 10 cycles while a debris storm approached, required solving approximately 40 engineering problems simultaneously. The hull sections were not designed to mate with Theta-Nine's external mounting points. The emitter power draws were incompatible with Theta-Nine's distribution grid. The field geometries, when activated, would overlap in ways the original designers had not intended, and that Chen was calculating on the fly on a whiteboard in the main engineering bay. The whiteboard filled. He erased it and started again. 14 hours before impact, the array was mounted. Power draw was routed through 3 independent distribution paths. The field overlap geometry had been resolved into something Chen believed would work, with the caveat that believed was doing significant work in that sentence. The crew chief on the exterior team had the voice of someone who had made her peace with the situation. On your signal. The debris cloud's leading edge was visible now without sensors. A soft diffusion of particulate catching the starlight, rolling toward them with the unhurried certainty of physics. Chen stood at the console. Signal. The grav plates activated. The station groaned, a deep structural sound that traveled through the deck plating into the soles of Chen's boots, through his legs, up his spine, and arrived in his back teeth as a vibration that felt like the building was deciding whether to stay a building. The power consumption readout climbed, leveled, climbed again, and held at 11% below the theoretical overload threshold. The debris cloud hit. The sound was everything and nothing, not individual impacts, just a sustained massive white noise that was the universe demonstrating what it would do to Theta-Nine if the field dropped for 3 consecutive seconds. The exterior cameras showed the leading edge of the cloud refracting around the station's position, bending away from the hull in curved trajectories that looked, on screen, almost elegant. The array held for 2 hours and 17 minutes. When the storm passed, the station was intact. 2 of the 4 grav plates had burned out their field coils in the final 40 minutes. The power distribution grid had rerouted itself automatically 17 times. None of the crew were injured, which was a better result than Chen had put in his private calculations. He logged the grav plate emitters as salvaged components recovered from storm debris. Technically true, because they had been recovered after the storm, and filed them under emergency self-sufficiency provisions. He marked their coordinates on the master construction map and moved on to the next problem. The reactor failure came 11 cycles later, at 3 in the morning, when the duty engineer's alert sent Chen from horizontal to vertical in the time it took his brain to register the alarm frequency. Theta-Nine's main fusion core had developed a containment field instability in the starboard emitter array. Not immediate meltdown, degrading. Given current consumption and degradation rate, approximately 40 cycles remained before catastrophic containment failure. They had no replacement core. They had no way to acquire one. Xylar's embargo covered all standard material requests. What they had in the salvage field surrounding Theta-Nine were the partial remains of 3 alien vessel types. The Kelthar destroyer that had provided the grav plates, a heavy transport of unknown registry that had been dead at the edge of the field for as long as Chen had been at Theta-Nine, and a compact survey vessel of foreign make whose crew had apparently abandoned it under circumstances the hull damage did not entirely explain. Each carried a fusion reactor of incompatible specification, incompatible power output, incompatible field geometry, and incompatible fuel grade. Chen looked at the schematics for all 3 for a long time. He drank 2 mugs of something that was not coffee, but performed the same function. Outside the engineering viewport, the salvage field drifted slowly in the dark, all those dead machines waiting. What if we don't replace the core? What if we build a new one? The Franken-reactor took 26 cycles to construct and was, technically, not a single reactor at all. It was 3 partial reactors operating in coordinated sequence, their plasma streams intersecting in a custom-built containment chamber that Chen had designed on the engineering whiteboard and immediately photographed in case someone spilled something on it. The Kelthar core provided raw fusion output. The heavy transport's plasma management system handled field stabilization with a precision the Caelthar design had never needed, because Caelthar engineers built things to be powerful rather than stable. The compact survey vessel's efficiency systems handled power distribution, squeezing 15% more usable output from the combined plasma stream than any of the individual components could have managed alone. The moment of first activation was quiet, which was not what anyone had expected. A low hum that deepened, steadied, and held, a sound like a star deciding to exist and then deciding to keep existing. The plasma stream on the monitoring display was the color of something that had never been given a name, because nothing on Earth had ever produced it. 3 crew members started crying. Chen did not, but it was a near thing. He filed the Franken-reactor under Clause 9C Emergency Prototype Testing Protocols. He filed the fuel source documentation as salvage reclamation under waste management provisions. He marked its position on the master construction map and drew a small star next to it, because it deserved one. The habitat crisis arrived 3 cycles later, because at Theta-Nine, problems did not observe recovery periods. Oxygen scrubbing capacity was at 61% of minimum crew requirement. The overcrowding from sealed-off damaged sections had put too many people in too small a breathing space, and the scrubbers were losing the argument with human biology. They needed more volume in cycles, not months. The asteroid field 14 kilometers off Theta-Nine's port side was rich in silicate and mineral content. Modified mining lasers, operating at sintering temperatures rather than cutting temperatures, could fuse that regolith into structural ceramic. Airtight, radiation-resistant, strong enough to hold pressure. They printed 3 habitat modules in 6 cycles. The printing process was not quiet or graceful. A sustained roar of laser energy and ejected particulate that left a vapor trail visible for 40 kilometers and produced habitat units that looked grown rather than built, their surfaces rough and warm to the touch for the first 12 hours after fabrication. They were airtight. They held pressure. They brought the oxygen scrubbers back above minimum threshold. Chen filed them as emergency sheltering under Article 8 humanitarian provisions and added their coordinates to the master map. Quellis arrived during the comet incident, which was unfortunate timing. The rogue comet had been flagged on long-range sensors 3 days prior. A 3-kilometer mass of ice and rock, with a trajectory that would bring it within 2 kilometers of Xylar's command vessel, if not deflected. Xylar's fleet was positioned to avoid it. The humans were technically not required to do anything. The comet came through the gravity well of the grav plate array the way water comes through a pipe, drawn, bent, redirected by a field geometry that was almost certainly not the intended use of 4 salvaged destroyer-grade emitters. The comet's adjusted trajectory missed Theta-Nine with comfortable margin. It also missed Xylar's command vessel, but not by nearly as much as Xylar's original projections had suggested it would. Chen was looking out the viewport with an expression of studied neutrality when Xylar's call came through. Oops. Calculations were a bit tight. Good thing our scrap holds together. Quellis was standing in the docking bay behind Xylar's communication terminal when the transmission ended, and she was the most dangerous person Chen had encountered in 12 months of Directorate inspections. Not because she was armed, she was not visibly armed, but because she was writing things down. Inspector Quellis of the Galactic Compliance Bureau was tall, green-gray, with the patient eyes of someone who has found the pattern and is now collecting evidence to confirm it. She was not here to demolish things. She was here to understand how the humans kept not being demolished, which was a substantially more dangerous investigation. Her stylus moved steadily across the data pad. She did not look up. I would like to conduct a full inventory of your salvage field, every component, every filing, every provisional registration, in order. Of course, Inspector. Chen activated the scanner swarm that night. 3,000 damaged drone circuits reactivated and networked into a coordinated survey fleet, filed as a mandated inventory management system under Directorate Order 774's compliance documentation requirements. The swarm spread across the salvage field in a cloud that blocked the stars like a weather system and produced an inventory that was complete, accurate, and thoroughly documented. It also produced, visible only on Chen's private terminal, the precise coordinates and structural assessment of every construction node in the salvage field, every position, every mass, every connection point for what was coming next. Quellis reviewed the inventory documentation for 11 hours. She filed a formal material embargo request at the end of hour 12, freezing all new salvage acquisition pending full compliance review. Chen looked at the embargo notice and then at the master map. The map had enough pieces to continue. He had known, when he started building, that there would come a point where someone smart noticed what was happening. He had built fast enough and filed correctly enough that by the time Quellis filed her embargo, everything that needed to be positioned was already positioned. Almost everything. He filed 17 provisional registrations overnight, each one adding a new layer of documentation that Quellis would have to review before any action could be taken. By the time she worked through them, he would be done. The first ring segment was large enough to cast a shadow on the stars. Chen stood at Theta-Nine's forward viewport and watched it rotate into alignment. A curved section of planetary rubble forge welded into a rigid arc, gray-black and vast, its surface rough with the texture of a world that no longer existed. He had been working on this particular piece for 40 cycles. He had been working on what this particular piece was for since cycle 1. Looking at it now, in the silence before the next inspection, the scale of the thing hit differently than it did on paper. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter and heavier. The understanding that what you have built is real. He turned from the viewport and went back to the filing documentation, because in 30 cycles, Xylar would arrive with a legal team. The Treaty of Vega Secundus, Article 19, subsection Agricultural Self-Sufficiency, granted quarantined populations the right to construct controlled growing environments sufficient to meet minimum nutritional requirements. The ring segments were, officially, exactly that. A series of centrifugal spin habitats designed to generate artificial gravity suitable for crop operations. Their kilometer-scale architecture a necessary engineering consequence of the requirement to sustain a crew under indefinite quarantine. Xylar stood in the main bay during the 14th cycle of construction and watched through the viewport as a second segment rotated into position beside the first, dwarfing the station that ostensibly it served. For a long time he was quiet. The silence had a quality to it, a being revising his understanding of a situation. Xylar's voice arrived after the silence. Agricultural zones. The crew has to eat, officer. Xylar looked at him. His copper eyes had changed over the past cycles. They had acquired a specific kind of attention, the attention of something that has started hunting and has not yet identified exactly what it is hunting. Those segments are not optimized for crop yield. They're optimized for structural durability under rotation. You can't grow food in a habitat that falls apart. The engineering specifications binder was already open on the console beside Chen. We can provide the full documentation if you'd like to review it. I would like to review everything. Quellis reviewed everything. She reviewed it for 40 cycles and found nothing that was not, on its face, compliant. She filed a request for galactic legal specialists. The specialists arrived in a transport vessel that parked at careful distance and immediately began generating their own documentation. While they were generating it, Chen built the Matryoshka nodes. The scanner swarm had been accumulating data for 30 cycles, and that data needed processing. The official reasoning was straightforward. A salvage operation of Theta-Nine's growing scale required computational infrastructure to manage inventory, compliance filings, safety monitoring, and the 17,000 other administrative tasks that the Directorate's own regulations required them to document. The salvaged supercomputer cores, stripped from the same wreckage fields that had provided the reactor components and the ring segment material, were not individually impressive. Networked together in a distributed architecture that used Theta-Nine's vacuum environment for passive heat dissipation, They became something that was technically several data storage centers operating in coordination. Xylar arrived for the inspection on a morning when the nodes were running hot from a 36-hour processing cycle. The station smelled faintly of warm metal and the specific electrical quality that large computing systems develop when they have been working hard. The node cluster glowed faintly at its venting points, visible through the engineering viewport. "What are those?" Chen kept his voice entirely conversational. "It's just a big hard drive, Officer Xylar, for all the paperwork." The legal specialist team filed a computational audit request 3 days later. Chen provided 14,000 pages of correctly formatted filing records, all accurate, none of them mentioning the mapping calculations the nodes had completed for the next phase of construction. The arcologies went up over 20 cycles, and they did not look like farm buildings. Technically was the only thing that mattered at this point, they were high-density residential structures, a necessity arising from the need to concentrate the crew's living space to free exterior volume for the agricultural ring infrastructure. In practice, they were towers of warship hull sections welded into vertical megastructures with the structural ratings of military installations, their exteriors bristling with sensor arrays and antenna clusters required for the administrative computing network, their interiors dense with life support redundancy that went significantly beyond what any purely residential application would justify. Xylar walked the exterior of Arcology 3 during his inspection and stood in silence for a long time. The structure rose approximately 200 meters above the station baseline, its gray-black hull steel surface eating the light rather than reflecting it, the sensor arrays along its upper sections rotating with the slow patience of things that have been given a job and intend to do it. "It looks like a weapons platform." "It's a building, officer. We filed the residential documentation on cycles 3, 7, and 11. Inspector Quellis has copies." Xylar looked at the arcology for another long moment. His carapace had developed a quality of tension that had not been present in the first inspection. A tightness across the shoulder articulations, a set to the jaw that was not boredom anymore. Something had changed in Xylar's calculations. Some variable he had previously assumed was small had revealed itself to be not small at all, and he did not yet know exactly what it was. He filed 7 inspection requests on his way out. Chen started work on the void anchors that night. The treaty's Article 23 addressed waste management for quarantined operations. Populations unable to access standard processing facilities were authorized to utilize locally available disposal methods, including energy-intensive compression systems for hyperdense materials. Microsingularity containment technology was not specifically prohibited under Article 23. It was not specifically mentioned under Article 23. The article had been written before microsingularity containment was a practical engineering capability, and no one had amended it. There were 6 of them. Each was approximately the size of a cargo container. Each contained a microsingularity stabilized by a containment field drawing power from the Franken-reactor. The light around each unit warped in a way that made looking at them directly uncomfortable. Not dangerous at operational distances, but deeply, viscerally wrong in the way that things which bend the fundamental geometry of space tend to be wrong. Like asking your eyes to process a color that does not exist on any spectrum they were designed for. Filed as waste compression systems, hyperdense material disposal units, Article 23 emergency provisions. The Kael'thar legal specialist who reviewed the filing stared at it for 11 cycles before escalating to a superior. The superior filed a request for clarification. Chen provided 1,400 pages explaining, in exhaustive technical detail, how Article 23's waste management provisions applied to the disposal of hyperdense salvage material. Every page accurate, every citation correct. None of them mentioning that 6 gravitational anchors, positioned at the precise coordinates the Matryoshka nodes had calculated, would, when activated in coordinated sequence, generate interlocking gravity fields capable of affecting the FTL navigation of anything larger than a shuttle in a sphere several light minutes across. The stellar forge took 12 cycles. Article 14 provided for industrial self-sufficiency operations. The forge was, officially, a materials refining installation, using focused reflective arrays to concentrate the local star's output on asteroid feedstock and produce refined metals for construction purposes. Its mirror array was visible from Xylar's command vessel with the naked eye. A constellation of hard reflective points around the star's limb, each one positioned exactly where the Matryoshka nodes had determined it needed to be. Xylar came to the docking bay without calling ahead on the day the forge achieved operational status. Chen had 4 minutes of warning from the sensor alert, which was not enough to change anything but was enough to be standing in the bay with the treaty binder when Xylar walked in. The forge array was on the exterior monitors. The star's refracted output, channeled through the mirror configuration, produced a stream of refined metal that glittered through the void in a continuous, slow cascade, cooling as it moved, forming ingots that the scanner swarm collected and directed to the construction zones. It was beautiful in the way that very large, very powerful industrial processes are sometimes beautiful. Xylar looked at it for a long time without speaking. "I know what you're doing." Not to Chen specifically, to the room maybe. To himself. "You have been building something since the first inspection. The debris zones, the reactor, the ring sections, the computation clusters. They are not independent projects. They connect." Chen held his silence. "I cannot prove it. Not yet. My legal team cannot find the violations because you have not committed violations. But I know." A step forward. Xylar was a full head taller than Chen, and his carapace carried the mass of something built for physical authority. "I am bringing a full fleet in 40 cycles for a final compliance review. If there is any element of this construction that does not comply with galactic regulation, I will end this." The silence after he left had a different quality than the silences before. Chen pulled up the master map. 40 cycles. He looked at what was built, what was placed, what was positioned. He looked at what was missing. One more piece. The request he drafted for Xylar was short and entirely reasonable, and it was the most dangerous document he had ever written. It requested permission to build a total environmental containment shell around the Theta-Nine operational zone, enclosing all construction projects, all reactor emissions, all scanner swarm activity. Exactly what Quellis had been demanding for the past 30 cycles. Total containment. Full compliance. Xylar's reply came back in 2 cycles. Granted. The humans began construction of the containment shell the following morning. The shell framework used the ring segment architecture. It integrated the arcology sensor networks. It connected to the grav plate arrays and the stellar forge mirror system, and the void anchor network in a unified structural grid. When the building call came through on the broadband, Chen answered it with the treaty binder open on the console beside him, and a grim smile on his face that he did not try to hide. "Total containment. You got it, officer. We're boxing it all in." He turned away before Xylar could look too carefully at his eyes, because his eyes had never been good at hiding what he knew. In 38 cycles, Xylar's fleet would arrive. Everything would be ready. The fleet arrived in 37 cycles. 22 Kalthar warships, heavy class and above, exiting FTL at the edge of the Theta-Nine sector, in a formation designed to communicate one thing, not tactical advantage, not operational necessity, but finality. The message was, "This ends now." They arranged in a standard containment envelope around Theta-Nine's coordinates and began their approach at inspection speed, which had the advantage of appearing procedural while making absolutely certain that nothing was going to escape. Xylar's command vessel led the formation. His communication hailed Theta-Nine while the fleet was still 40,000 kilometers out. Chief Engineer Chen. This is the final compliance review under Directorate Order 774. All construction on Theta-Nine is suspended pending inspection. Any attempt to operate equipment, launch vessels, or activate systems during the inspection will be treated as active non-compliance and addressed accordingly. Is that understood? Chen was standing in Theta-Nine's main engineering bay, surrounded by his crew, looking at the master map on the central display. The map showed Theta-Nine at the center. It showed the ring segments, the arcology sensor network, the grav plate arrays, the Matryoshka nodes, the 6 void anchors at their calculated coordinates, the stellar forge mirror array, the scanner swarm in its repositioned formation. All of it mapped, all of it positioned, all of it connected in documentation that no one in the Caelthar legal team had managed to piece together, because they had been looking at each element individually and had never stood far enough back to see the shape. Chen's voice was even. Understood. He looked at Riley. Her voice was very quiet. Is it ready? Chen looked at the map for a moment longer. All those months, all those cycles, all those 4-minute EVA rotations and crew members who got out almost in time, and a whiteboard that had been erased and rewritten so many times the surface had started to wear through. All of it visible now in the geometry of the thing they had built. Give the signal. Riley pressed a single key. The shell activated first. Not with a sound, not with a flash. It was a vast structure in silent vacuum, and it moved with the silence of vast things. The ring segments rotated to their locked positions. The sensor networks synchronized across the arcology towers. The structural grid completed in the space between components that had always been designed to connect. On Xylar's navigation systems, 22 Caelthar vessels watched their charts update in real time as new structures registered. Not appearing, because they had always been there, but now revealed as what they were. The gaps in the tactical map filling with solid returns. Then the void anchors came online. There was no warning for the way that felt. Not to the crew of a Caelthar warship, not to sensors, not to the physics of the space those ships occupied. Gravity is patient. It does not announce itself. It simply existed, in 6 new coordinated sources, and the navigation systems began their error cascades with the quiet efficiency of systems doing exactly what they were designed to do, alerting crew to the fact that something was wrong with the local gravitational topology. Every ship in the formation was inside the 6-point anchor geometry. The FTL envelope calculation systems, which required precise gravitational mapping to function, went dark simultaneously across 22 vessels. They could not jump, they could not safely accelerate. They were, in the technical vocabulary of Caelthar navigation, anchored. Xylar's communication came through 6 seconds after anchor activation. In the 140 cycles Chen had been dealing with Demolition Officer Xylar of the Caelthar Enforcement Directorate, he had never heard Xylar's voice sound like this. Stripped of boredom, stripped of procedural calm, stripped of the specific quality of authority that comes from knowing you have more firepower than the other party. What was left underneath was something that had walked into a room and found that the room had changed shape around it. What have you done? Chen looked at the master map, at the shell enclosing the sector, at the ring segments that were not farm walls, at the arcologies that were not apartment buildings, at the stellar forge whose mirror array was, right now, oriented with precise computational accuracy toward the space between Xylar's command vessel and the edge of the formation. At the scanner swarm repositioning across the sector in a pattern that had nothing to do with inventory management. At 6 cargo container-sized objects holding pieces of bent space, holding Xylar's fleet in place with the patient, in different mathematics of gravity. He turned to the communication array. Wait! He let the single word land before continuing. You're not locked in here with us. You're locked in here with us. For 4 seconds, the only sounds in the main engineering bay were the hum of the Franken-reactor and the soft cycling of the environmental systems and, very faintly, The distant sound of 22 Kael'thar warships running navigation error diagnostics that were not going to produce the results their crews wanted. Then one of the junior crew started laughing, which set off two others. And then it was moving through the room the way things move through rooms when they have been held in for a long time and have finally found somewhere to go. Chen waited for it to settle before opening the broadband communication frequency. Attention, Kael'thar Fleet. Attention, Inspector Quellis. Attention, Galactic Compliance Bureau, Nova Station Branch. He was reading from nothing. He had been composing this for 140 cycles. What you are seeing on your navigation systems is not a malfunction. The gravitational anomalies are being generated by 6 waste disposal compression units designated Theta-Nine, anchors 1 through 6, operating under Article 23 emergency provisions as filed and documented with the Compliance Bureau. The structural enclosure surrounding your formation is the environmental containment shell mandated by Inspector Quellis's Compliance Order of Cycle 72, constructed under the agricultural and self-sufficiency provisions of Articles 14 and 19 of the Treaty of Vega Secundus. Every component is documented. Every filing is in order. Every registration is current. There are no violations. A pause. Quellis. The tone shifted slightly, less formal. You found the pattern. I know, you were right. We were not building independent compliance projects. We were building one thing. It took 140 cycles because that is how long it takes to build this thing correctly, one piece at a time, under your inspection regime, without breaking a single rule. I want you to know that I respect what you did. You were the only one who actually understood what was happening. I am sorry the timeline did not favor your side. Quellis's response came back 9 seconds later. One word. How long? The debris clearing in Cycle 1 put the first construction coordinates in place. The solar sail positions. Everything since then was a component of what you are currently inside. The silence after that was the silence of something being reconsidered at a fundamental level. Xylar's communication returned on a private channel. His voice had settled into something flatter and colder than anything Chen had heard from him, which was, in its own way, a form of respect. What do you want? The same things we wanted in Cycle 1. To operate, to expand, to not be vaporized. A pause. The fleet can power down non-essential systems. You will be comfortable. We will begin the filing process for release of the gravitational containment once the Compliance Bureau has reviewed and approved a revised operational framework for Theta-Nine. That review should take 40 to 60 standard cycles. 40 to 60 standard cycles. Xylar's own timeline, his own administrative window, reflected back. The response from the Alien Council came in Cycle 12 of the standoff. Not from Xylar, not from Quellis, but from the Council's executive communication tier, a level of response that indicated the blockade had reached people with authority to resolve it. The communication acknowledged the legal validity of the Theta-Nine operation. It acknowledged the structural integrity of the human filings. It acknowledged, with the specific, careful phrasing of an entity that has consulted many lawyers, that no violations had been committed. It proposed a formal renegotiation of the quarantine zone's operational parameters. Chen read the proposal twice. Then he read Article 9C's subsection governing the administrative rights of registered prototype test sites, and Article 12's language on radiation disposal mandates, and the specific paragraph of the Treaty of Vega Secundus that addressed the operational authority of self-sufficient quarantine installations that had demonstrated independent infrastructure capacity. He brought the crew together in the main bay, all of them, the EVA operators and the reactor engineers and the documentation specialists and the 2 crew members who had not fully recovered from their radiation exposure, but had insisted on being present and were sitting in the back with the expressions of people who have earned the right to watch the last part. He read them the relevant paragraph. Then he opened the broadband frequency. To the Galactic Council, the Kael'thar Enforcement Directorate, and the Galactic Compliance Bureau. He picked up the treaty binder from the console. Its cover was worn at the corners, and its spine was cracked from use. He held it so the visual transmission picked it up. Though he was not performing for the camera, it was simply the right object to have in his hands at this specific moment, the way a tool is the right thing to hold at the end of a job. According to Galactic Regulation 9C, subsection Find Out, we are now in charge of sector security. Compliance is mandatory. The Council's acknowledgement of the Theta-Nine sector authority arrived in Cycle 14. 14 pages of legal qualification. One operative sentence in the executive summary: effective immediately, Theta-Nine would serve as the administrative hub for sector security operations under human management, with jurisdiction over inspection protocols, transit authorization, and enforcement. Riley read it twice. She looked out the forward viewport at the shell structure and the anchored fleet and the ring segments that had never been farms, and the arcologies that had never been apartment buildings, and the stellar forge that was, right now, continuing to produce refined metal, because the construction of the sector's new administrative infrastructure was going to require a great deal of material. What do we do now? Chen looked out the viewport at all of it, everything they had built, all of it humming and rotating and operating with the patient certainty of something that had been built to last. And he thought about the first inspection, about the thrum of the demolition rig settling into his chest, about the 4-minute rotations and the 3 crew members who had started crying when the Franken-reactor first came online. Chen's eyes stayed on the viewport. We get to work. Outside the viewport, the structure that had started as a shuttle full of salvaged machinery and a binder full of rules gleamed against the stars, vast and cold and theirs. Every piece of it had been built by hand, under a weapon pointed at their heads, one regulation at a time. The Caelthar had given them the law as a leash. The humans had followed it all the way to the end and found out what the law was attached to.